Right, good evening, people. Welcome to Waterstones. This is the fourth of the events in this year's Spring Festival. It's going well so far, and we expect it will go on going well, particularly this evening with a really interesting presentation for you. LitFest is made possible by significant support and help from the Centre MK, Milton Keynes City Council, Waterstones, our hosts, Milton Keynes Libraries, Community Learning MK, and the Open University, and of course our parent organisation Arts Gateway, to all of whom we're very grateful and without whom we wouldn't be here. This evening's event is a fascinating conversation about borders and their implication for literature. We're now in the third year of our collaboration with the Open University, and each year we've had 4 online events, which we've had this year, followed by a live face-to-face discussion conversation, which is what we're going to enjoy this evening. All our previous events in the series are available either as podcasts on Spotify, on YouTube, or via our website. So I'm now delighted to welcome on stage author Jonn Elledge, about whom our moderator will say a little bit more, and from the Open University, academic, writer and translator, Daria Chernysheva. So welcome to both of you. Please welcome them with a round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John. And now over to Jonn Elledge. So I'm very, very pleased to be in conversation with Jonn Elledge today, who is a contributor to The Big Issue, The New Statesman, The Guardian, and Wired, as well as the weekly newsletter of Not Quite Everything. He was previously assistant editor at The New Statesman, where he was responsible for launching and editing the urbanism site City Metric, hosting the Skyline podcast, and writing many, many angry columns about the housing crisis. Jonn is the author of A History of the World in 47 Borders, but also of the book titled The Compendium of Not Quite Everything, and with co-author Tom Phillips, Conspiracy, A History of Bollocks Theories and How to Not Fall for Them. His forthcoming book is titled 35 Inventions That Changed Our World, The Making of Modern Life, and I believe that is due out in August and can be pre-ordered with Waterstones. So today, to get us started with A History of the World in 47 Borders, Jonn will read one of the shorter chapters from the book to give you a flavor of content and style.
It's also only 31 inventions now. I rather sort of overdid it, so we've had to drop a couple, but they will be on my newsletter if anyone wants to know what they're missing. Yeah, I like to start these things by reading one of my favorite stories from the book, partly because it's one of the origin stories of the book. It came from I first found out about it in a BBC documentary called Tales from the Map Room, which my grandfather very kindly recorded for me in 1993, and which, when I rewatched it a couple of years ago, I realized had shaped about 40% of my brain single-handedly. But also, as Daria suggests, another reason I like to read this one out is because it gives a real sense of the tone of the book, and also, crucially, it is quite short. So it's not one of the more famous border stories. It's about the Sudan-Uganda Border Commission of 1913. Have we got any fans of that in the house? Hey, okay. There are a couple of especially insidious things about the borders that emerged from the high imperial age of the late 19th century. One is that, thanks to both improvements in mapping and to the way access to such technologies have reshaped how people conceived of the world, it was now possible for distant powers, normally white, normally European, to carve up territories they'd never even visited for a tool no more substantial than a pen. The other was the fact that even those who had decent intentions and tried to do it the hard way could still ultimately find themselves screwing up the world. In 1882, in an attempt to stamp on the sort of nationalist instability that might interrupt traffic through the Suez Canal, that's a bit on the nose right now, isn't it? The British had conquered Egypt, but then, to avoid upsetting the Ottoman Empire, of which Egypt was still officially a part, pretended that they hadn't. For the next 30 years, Egypt was subject to a form of government sometimes described as the Veiled Protectorate. Not officially a part of the British Empire, but in practice governed by a bunch of British administrators who claimed to be merely advising the Egyptian government. All this gave Britain a geopolitical interest in stability up the Nile. So together, the British, and their definitely not a colony Egypt, fought a war against Sudan and ruled it as an odd sort of condominium, in which one of the two countries responsible was also a colony of the other. Later on, Britain conquered Uganda, the region to the south believed to contain the river's source too. Even though these territories were all British, they were governed by different people using different structures, who needed to know where their domain ended and someone else's began. So, in 1912, the Governor-General of Sudan created a commission tasked with establishing a border between his territory and its southern neighbour, which would, quote, not divide any single tribe between them. Thus it was that, on the 15th of January 1913, a convoy including over 100 men, 50 camels, 320 donkeys and 20 mules, assembled at the South Sudanese city of Nimule, with a view to surveying and mapping the roughly 400 miles of territory between there and Lake Rudolph. The team was largely composed of locals, but at its head were two British Army captains. Running the Sudanese side of affairs was one Captain Harry Kelly, a career soldier and champion heavyweight boxer who had been in the Royal Engineers until being seconded to the Egyptian army in Sudan in 1903. He was excellently qualified for the job, having previously surveyed stretches of Sudan's frontiers with both Abyssinia and Congo. And he was determined to do right by the locals, no matter how long the job took. Heading up the Ugandan side of the commission, meanwhile, was one Captain Tufnell. The main thing history records about Captain Tufnell is that he was tired. Really, really tired. Now District Commissioner of Lake Rudolph Province, he had been working for 2 years without a break, and all he wanted to do was to go on leave. And this dastardly commission and its stupid boundaries were in his way. In many cases, we know little of the process by which today's international boundaries were decided. In this case, though, we know rather a lot, because Captain Kelly lovingly recorded the survey team's exploits in his diary. And the main thing he recorded, the single biggest factor in determining the exact course of this boundary, was the slow-motion collapse of his relationship with Captain Tufnell. The team took just over a month to cover the first 120 miles of the boundary, as far as a place named Madior. That works out to somewhat less than 4 miles a day, which really isn't that much, though it no doubt feels longer when you have a bunch of camels, mules and donkeys to contend with. But this was through potentially hostile territory. Rumours abounded of local conflicts and gun running, and of course they were surveying the land, so in practice almost certainly covering a lot more ground than those raw numbers suggest. A perambulator wheel in the charge of one of the team showed distances of more like 8 to 12 miles each day. Kelly was constantly nipping about the place in search of high ground, so may well have travelled even further. Just as big a problem as the distances, or the security risks, or the mules, however, was the gulf between the two leaders' approaches to their work. It wasn't merely that Tufnell didn't want to be there and was more than happy to announce the fact. He also thought that Kelly's determination to map tribal boundaries and keep on good terms with the locals was silly. Better, Tufnell thought, to let them know who was boss by, in not so many words, beating the living daylights out of them at the slightest provocation. Kelly's diary contains endless tales of Tufnell and his men violently disarming local tribespeople or burning their huts to the ground just to assert themselves. This went down about as well with the locals the expedition relied on as guides as you would imagine, and they kept quitting. And throughout all this, as Kelly did his best to get to grips with the cultural differences and appropriate physical boundaries between the Acholi and the Toposa and the Koroko, who may also have been the Dodinga, and to deal with the fact that the locals were almost certainly lying to him about other locals, he also had to put up with listening to Tufnell constantly bitching about the fact that he didn't give a shit about local tribal boundaries, that he knew perfectly well the best place to put the border without talking to anyone, and that he'd been in this stupid hot country for quite long enough, and why couldn't he go home? So eventually, when he reached Madior, he did, taking the entire Uganda team with him. That, Kelly thought, was quite all right with him. Tufnell thinks of nothing but getting on leave, he wrote in his diary on 16th of February. I confess I'm glad to get rid of him, as he has been little help and has left all the burden of gaining information to me. I am, moreover, not at all an admirer of the methods of which he is the chief exponent of dealing with the natives, which is one way of saying you think violently assaulting people is not a recipe for peaceful relationships and good government, I suppose. Kelly's Sudan side of the commission trundled on for another 80 miles or so, covering perhaps 4 times that distance in total. But by this time, the remaining team was almost as exhausted and bad-tempered as Tufnell had been from the start. Everyone's skin was torn to shreds by fawn scrub. The camels were hungry and dying of sleeping sickness. To address the revolving door of local guides, the survey team had tried handcuffing them to physically prevent them from literally running away. This worked fine up to the point where someone lost the key, forcing one poor soul to do the entire trip with them until they reached a settlement large enough to provide tools to cut the blasted things off. Changing hands. And so, having climbed Mount Magilla, fretting about the rapidly dwindling supplies of food and water, and finding that he could not see a water source from its peak, Kelly decided it was time to give up. The last third of the boundary between the Sudanese condominium and the Uganda protectorate was never surveyed by the British at all. They never even visited it. Just 3 days after Kelly and his team gave up, the dry season came to an end and the heavens opened. A shortage of water, it turned out, would not have been a problem. The survey teams reported their findings to their political masters back in London. Some of them were taken into account, but for the last third of the boundary, they made no recommendations. Having not got that far, they couldn't. And so, for all Kelly's good, if rather paternalist intentions, the result of his failure was made painfully plain on the map. The western end of the border the team surveyed is complex and detailed. The eastern consists of a series of straight lines, up to 100 miles long. It's hard to believe that this was the best reflection of the borders between tribal territories in this part of Africa. One of these straight lines, the one between Mount Magilla, in fact, the one beyond Mount Magilla, in fact, which divides Sudan from Uganda's Rudolph province, transferred to Kenya in 1926, marks one side of the Ilemi Triangle, which is still claimed by both Sudan and Kenya to this day. If you don't bother surveying a region, it turns out, you're storing up border disputes for the future. Sudan won its independence from the British Empire in 1955, Uganda 7 years later, and Kenya the following year. In 2011, South Sudan broke away from Sudan to become Africa's newest nation. But still, maps of this part of Africa contain oddly straight lines, because some British army officers in the years before the First World War were simply too tired to come up with anything better. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, John. It's a bit of a recurring story, right, in this book, that somebody who is not a local is going around and charting borders and trying to figure out where a certain boundary lies. And it has implications for the people living there who are often not the people drawing these borders, right? And ultimately, in a lot of these stories, what happens is that the locals are either misplaced or they're forced to change languages or they're forced onto an exodus, and there's all kinds of negative repercussions. There are a few examples, however, in your book of self-determination, right? I think borders through voting, through public vote. I think Detroit is a really good example as well of kind of public policy and public ability to vote on a city's borders. Do you think borders can be democratic? Can we democratically decide on our borders in the future? Will border creation be a democratic exercise, or is it still, whoever has the biggest army and the biggest guns?
I didn't think you were going to go to Detroit in that question. That's an interesting. I mean, yeah, that is one of the things I think is so terrifying about the era we're living through, is the realization that I think, like, if you grow up in a world where, like, you have one way of doing geopolitics, and it's not just your world, it's your parents' world and possibly your grandparents as well, it's easy to assume that this is just what the world is like now. And it hit me in a sort of if a blinding flash can be terrifying, a terrifying blinding flash, a couple of years ago, that, like, it has been less long since 1945 than the period between the Congress of Vienna at the end of the Napoleonic Wars and World War I, when there was 99 years of peace in broadly peace in Europe, Western Europe certainly. And there were lots of, there were border disputes, there were tiny wars, the Prussians marched into Paris and so on. But we kind of didn't have those sort of big conflagrations for a whole century. And we've all, I mean, I say maybe you're more cynical than me, but I think a lot of us sort of assume that the world since 1945 is just the world now. And what we've been learning for the last 10 years, and certainly for the last 4, is that that is not true. And that actually we are moving back into a world in which might is to some extent right. I mean, one thing that kind of unites the presidents of the US, Russia, and China is that they all believe in that doctrine, and they all think that, like, that they should get to push small countries around and claim what territory they want. And for a lot of history, that is the norm. And that's. I'm always reluctant to kind of go too far down the road of suggesting Europeans invented imperialism. We were just really good at it because we happened to be getting into the game at the point when kind of like maps and artillery and a bunch of other technologies enabled it to become a global affair. But that was always sort of the way. If you go back to ancient times, like the Roman and Chinese empires, the kind of working the same way. They just kind of don't have quite the control over border territories that the Europe. But yeah, no, I think borders clearly can be defined democratically because there are plenty of examples of that happening. But they also define just through strength a lot of the time. And as you alluded to in your question, like a lot of the time that's also meant population movements, which, depending on how violent they are, when we maybe do or don't call ethnic cleansing, but that is effectively the result of what we're talking about here.
I mean, not to kind of jump onto Brexit, but that arguably you could say that it was a democratic, right, way of deciding on borders.
Yeah, no, I completely think it was. I mean, like Brexit is one of the origin stories of the book because I sort of always, this might come as a shock to people, but I'm a bit of a nerd. And I grew up on, Star Trek and a bunch of other sort of TV sci-fi things where, like, they kind of do one world government as like it's a metaphor for space America, sort of a lot of the time. But nonetheless, that was kind of in my head as like the direction of travel. And I thought the EU was a sort of step on that path to a non-sinister one world government where we were going to solve some of our problems together. And the story of Brexit was kind of an early harbinger of the fact that maybe that process was going into reverse. It's not the only one. I mean, there's plenty of the number of countries in the world has increased rather than fallen in the last 30 years because the USSR and Yugoslavia have fallen to bits, but there have also been a lot of other countries that, Ethiopia, Eritrea split off Ethiopia and South Sudan off Sudan and so on. The number of countries has increased, which is kind of like the opposite of what I just said. But I think in kind of like the West, there is a sense of us kind of moving closer together. And that's clearly not what's happening right now. But Brexit was, in a very real sense, about Britain voting to kind of say, no, this is us and this isn't. And I think that's one of the reasons it proved so traumatic for people, particularly on the Remain side, who didn't realize how strongly they felt about it until they lost. And it felt like, for a lot of people, I think it felt like part of their identity being wrenched away because this really matters to people. That's why people fight over it. I mean, like the sort of corollary of the thing I just said about feeling like we're moving in imagining us having been moving away from a world of nation states, about which I was completely and totally wrong, is that I think I didn't sort of grasp how important these forces are. And how like they don't just kind of get erased by time. It is one of the big engines of history.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's a very good point. I think as someone as well who isn't perhaps very strongly attached to a particular nation state, kind of, or perhaps you're not, you have to be put in that situation where you are forced to reckon about which place in the world you feel most strongly about and where your identity is.
Well, I mean, forgive me, we didn't have much time to speak beforehand. I don't actually know where like your family hail from or anything. But it is certainly true that kind of like Central and Eastern Europe, there are a lot more stories of people just kind of staying in one place, but the nation they are part of changing 6 times in a century or something. I think like another reason why people at this end of Europe, and especially on this island, don't necessarily kind of have the same understanding of these issues is because we imagine that there is sort of a natural border because we are on an island, and because our nearest big neighbor is France, which, like England, has been around for a millennium. These are very old, very established nation states. And the idea that actually a lot of nations are relatively recent creations, and the world of nation states is really a product of the last couple of centuries, which we project back and therefore and imagine these places have been around forever. And that's actually pretty unusual. I mean, there's another very good book about borders, in some ways, I fear, better than my own. Lewis Baston's book, Borderlines, which came out, is a friend of mine. It came out around the same time, and he's a lovely man. He, unlike me, has actually done all the travel of going to these places. And his book is very focused on Europe of the last 200 years, whereas mine goes all over the place, both in time and space. But Lewis tells so many stories of towns where, family history, local history, and national history just do not align at all. Because in this particular village, it's been kind of handed round between imperial forces that were playing pass the parcel over centuries. And as I say, I think particularly on this island, we sometimes kind of don't understand that is in fact how a lot of the world works.
Yeah, I mean, very much so. And I think what one gets from your book is that has been more common, right, before kind of 19th century, 18th century, and this consolidation of the emergence of the nation state, which moreover has a linguistic identity, right? I mean, most of my background is about kind of border crossing between languages and changing languages. But for most of history, it was not at all, it was not at all that, you had this very defined nation state with precise borders and that people uniquely spoke one language in this one area, right? There would have been a lot of different languages. People would have been multilingual. They would have,
or languages run into each other.
Yep.
Or dialects, kind of like you get border dialects. I mean, a lot of things happen around the 1840s because of the railways, basically, because suddenly it becomes possible for the imperial centre to exert force. But also the railways mean the rise of mass media in the form you can print a newspaper in Vienna and take it around the entire empire in a way like you just didn't have those communication links at that kind of speed beforehand. So there is a reason, like all the nationalist revolutions start in 1848 and so on. It's because suddenly it is possible to travel hundreds of miles in hours rather than days. But you do get not only nationalities but kind of linguistic groups kind of like solidifying and codifying in a way you never had before, I think.
And so to take this question of what technology makes possible, but also what borders make possible. I was curious about, we tend to think of borders as keeping people out, keeping stuff out, keeping ethnicities segregated, but also borders permit there to be a point of access, right? So, you build your wall or your ditch or something, then you've got one point, maybe multiple points that you control and people can kind of pass through it. And then you can also make the people who are bringing stuff into your domain pay you some money, right? So you have a few very interesting examples. The Mongolian Empire, for example, which you kind of present as quite an interesting development for free trade and Europe benefiting from all this, the network that they're able to construct under their domain. So in what sense might we say borders are actually useful for the really complex, economically complex society or world that we enjoy now? Are they not in some sense that kind of foundation that allows taxes and bureaucracy to be constructed?
Yeah, I mean, completely. You need another thing I've changed my mind about is kind of I don't think borders are going anywhere because on the most basic level, you need to know who you are paying taxes to. You need to know whose law you are following. And people don't have to invest their entire identity in this stuff, in which side of a line they happen to be from. But nonetheless, as an administrative tool, you do need that. And that goes all the way back through history. So like the book, it starts in the ancient world. And they look at the Great Wall of China and they look at the limits of the Roman Empire. Something that both Hadrian's Wall and the Great Wall of China have in common is they're not hard borders in the way we understand them now. Roman power sort of gradually fades out. So this end of the country, actually, I was walking through the shopping centre over here. I came across a mosaic on the wall from the 4th century, which is delightful. I didn't know that Milton Keynes went back that far. Newtown, my arse. But yeah, this end of Rome, this end of Britannia, by the time you get to the 3rd, 4th century, is not as Romanized as the Mediterranean, but it's probably as Romanized as most of Gaul. And even by the time you get to what is now the north of England, which was inside the empire, or to Wales, it's a lot less under Roman control, and so like the Hadrian's Wall was probably more of a sort of tripwire than a hard line. It was somewhere you could sort of like you could station your kind of legionaries and they kind of monitor what the weird people to the north were doing, and tax them if they tried to go past. But it wasn't kind of like a hard line, and that's actually how a lot of those kind of ancient empires worked because again, they didn't have the technology to kind of like do, okay, this is us and this is something else. And also you think about the Roman Empire, it very rarely faced on to a comparable power in its kind of heyday. It's only really Persia in the East. And that meant centuries of war. Generally speaking, like where Roman power fades out, there's a desert or there's a sea or there's Scotland. But yeah, it was like you didn't kind of have national boundaries in the way that you conceptualize them now. But they were kind of like they were still nonetheless these sort of tools where you can kind of like use them for defensive purposes, but also for fiscal purposes, essentially. And the same applied on a bigger scale to the Great Wall in China. It was a nation building project, but it was also a communications artery, and it was a way of like trying to kind of keep out those wild people to the north with limited success. As the Mongolian Empire, which you referenced, kind of says. I did a chapter on the Mongols because, again, to some extent, the book is an excuse for me to kind of spend a couple of weeks learning about lots of bits of history I feel guilty I didn't know about. And again, as a Western European, like the Mongols don't really kind of feature in our narrative. That's not true if you're Hungarian or Russian, let alone, from somewhere even further east. But it's like such a sort of key moment in the sort of development of history in the whole of Eurasia, because it knocks out the caliphate, which had been kind of the superpower for half a millennium. That's never quite the same again. It gives the Russians a complex that they're arguably not really over yet, about just the need to kind of like be on the defensive and expansionist the whole time. It also means this giant free trade area, like the Chinese. I can't, which dynasty? It's the Ming, the Mongols knock out, isn't it? The Chinese under the Ming don't really sort of think much of manufacturing. They kind of think like if you're a merchant, that's a bit kind of gauche. The Mongols love merchants because they bring them great stuff, and the Mongols don't want to make stuff themselves. They want people to bring them stuff. So you end up with this massive free trade area across the whole of Eurasia, effectively, which means suddenly all these kind of like great innovations that they've had in Persia or the Arab world or China that have never made it to Western Europe, they're suddenly here. And then when that Mongol free trade area falls after about a century, I don't think it's a coincidence that like that's about the point European imperialism really kicks off, because you get the Portuguese thinking, well, this is rubbish. We no longer have access to all this stuff. Let's start building some boats and go get it. So yeah, that's not really a borders thing, I suppose, but it is like they are kind of this borders, and their absence are kind of like these kind of definitional things for the whole of history, I think. And actually, a conversation I had last thing, because I'm rambling now, but one of the conversations they had very early on in the book is I spoke to a guy called Philip Steinberg, who's at the University of Durham, who runs their International Borders Research Unit, I think. And he explained to me at great length there's actually a difference between boundaries and borders, because the line is a boundary, but the border is the point of connection. It's the point you go through at the airport. And actually, it was very important to kind of understand the difference between those two things. And I appreciated this time, and I nodded along, and I explained it in one line in the introduction, and then totally ignore it for the rest of the book because it gets. But yeah, there is there is an argument that borders are actually the point of connection rather than that of division.
And this book, I mean, it is about borders being artificial throughout, right? It's about kind of, our world doesn't have to look the way it looks like. We're just used to seeing it on Google Maps. And, hopefully we'll get to the Google Maps question a little later as well. But it's all about, it's the history of people sometimes just drawing lines, right? Lines in places they haven't even seen, as what happens in the case when Europe starts to kind of carve up the world, and continents that it hasn't actually laid eyes on. I'm wondering if technology has allowed us to now start making not only borders, but making land itself. So this was in the papers again, and it's something you mentioned in your book. So every once and again, the papers will report that China is building islands in the South China Sea. And, very much building an island that wasn't there and kind of shoring up its claims, as you put it, to maritime borders, to the resources that may exist, in that given sea. And thank you very much as well. I learned so much about maritime borders from this book, and I didn't realize the importance of islands and why these very large nations might want to fight about very small specks of land in the sea until you've pointed out that it's really what's in the seabed and how far they can, profit from these resources. So, beyond remapping, are we at this point where we now have the technology and, the human power to literally like remake the Earth? And are there any historical instances of something quite similar?
I don't know how far back you want to go. I think like land reclamation it's not new. I don't know. I can't think of any really good historic example. I mean, like the Netherlands has a big flood in about the 12th century. I actually only realized this researching the book I'm finishing off now. But there's a huge storm in the 12th or 13th centuries that take out quite a large chunk of what is now the Netherlands, and they spend the next 600-700 years gradually reclaiming it through polders and windmills and canals and so on. So that's a very long-term project. I think it's certainly something we've got. The technology for it has got better, and Dubai has a whole load of weird fake islands, doesn't it? Which I don't think have quite the impact on geopolitics that the ones in the South China Sea do. Although I haven't checked the news today, so maybe but yeah, no, there is this. China claims a large chunk of the South China Sea based on having explored some islands centuries ago, which is not how this works. But China is quite big and scary, so they still think they can assert it. So a couple of things kind of come from that. One of which is the Barbie movie was banned in large chunks of Asia because at one point there is something that looks a bit like a map with some dotted lines on it, which was seen as possibly a reference to the 9-dash line through which China claims large chunks of so I can't remember which countries. Thailand, I think, is one of them. And you wouldn't think that the Barbie movie would be kind of such a locus for geopolitical rage, and yet. But it's not just so. Like China's been building up some of these islands to kind of shore up its claim, but it's not the only one. There is kind of a fake island somewhere in that region, which Japan claims, and it's technically a suburb of Tokyo. Just in terms of how it's categorized administratively, even though it's like 2,000 miles of open ocean away, and one can only assume that they've done this. So it's not just Japanese; it's actually part of our capital. So it's a bit offensive to try and appropriate that. But yeah, so the technology has improved in ways that are going to complicate it, I think. Yeah, certainly. But I don't think I think something else that we are going to have brought home to us in horrible ways over the next few decades is we perhaps do not have quite the mastery of our environment that we've imagined we do. And you can't necessarily just kind of like we're going to be losing land, not necessarily claiming new bits of it. So we shall see.
Thank you. And to continue, this question of how technology is going to change things around borders and cartography. You do dedicate a chapter to kind of map making in the age of kind of Google, right, and satellite imagery and all of this technology and, massive amounts of data that make it possible for us to double check where anything is at a moment's notice. And you do say, it's the first moment in history in which everyone is looking at the same maps and expecting them to reflect their own worldview. Because as you say, sometimes Google Maps does not actually display the same thing depending on what country you're accessing it from, right? So if you're accessing or, any other kind of map provider from, say, within Russia, Crimea is going to look slightly different to if you're looking at it, or in even maybe parts of Ukraine now, depending on, if you're looking at it, if you're accessing Google Maps from the UK or from the US. And so despite the fact that we have this quote unquote objective ability to look at the world from space and to map it down to pinpoint, we still might see different things depending on what government is kind of legislating our access to the internet. But I guess my question isn't that, because as you point out, all of history is about the misinterpretations or one's interpretation about where a border ends and where something ends, another patch of land begins. But I suppose what's different now is that we I guess have this assumption that we can check something to be true. And no matter what our truth is, we have immediate access to all this data online that we can point to. We can say, well, actually, yeah, just look at Google Maps or, ask ChatGPT and it'll give you this information. So I suppose I'm thinking a little bit about truth because a couple of departments at the OU are organizing a conference dedicated to truth and discourse. It'll be a free and public conference in November. But yeah, so what do you make of kind of truth and technology and being able to see the world instantly and to check what your truth is?
I mean, I think the internet has certainly driven us all insane. That's definitely true. I mean, another kind of sort of the losses of innocence the last 10 years. I used to be very excited about the potential of the internet to bring us together. And it turns out that one of the groups of people it brings together are Nazis. But I do think so I'll come back to the maps question in a second, but I do think actually I have this theory that that's also about borders. And that's partly because I've got a book to sell, but it's partly also because I think these things often have backlashes. So I think social media has created a new sense of where us ends. So, as with Brexit, where it turned out that half the country felt Europe was their country and half didn't. I think watching a lot of the stuff out the States this year, I've kind of been watching events in Minneapolis and have a very strong sense of on some level, we are under attack. That makes no sense because I've never been to Minnesota. I'm not American. I am not under attack from the US government or ICE. That's not, but nonetheless, I have a definite sense that this is my side and this is not. And I think that's probably a sense that is recognizable to at least some of you. I think a version of that will certainly be recognizable to everyone. And I think one of the results of that is that people, just as the railways and the newspapers and the arrival of mass media expanded people's sense of who we were, I think the internet has done the same, but not in a geographical sense. And I think that is one of the forces that is screwing everything up right now. This is me trialing something I keep meaning to write down as a column somewhere. On the map specific thing, yeah, no, that's the Ukraine one. I think was the first anyone noticed. It was Alex Hearn, who was then at the Guardian, is now at the Economist, wrote a piece about how if you look at a map of Crimea, this is about 2015, so it was just after the Russians had taken Crimea. If you looked at a map of Crimea in most of the world, it showed the border in one way, but if you showed it in Russia, it showed it in a different way. And the reason for that is because if Google didn't do that, Google had staff in Russia, and if Google didn't show Russian people a particular view of the world, Google staff were going to prison or worse. And there are multiple countries in the world that do variants on this. India does it to some extent. But I think once upon a time, this stuff didn't matter because we all knew that you picked up an atlas, it had probably been printed 20 years ago, you understood bits of it were going to be out of date, there was something a little bit dusty about it. Whereas now you look at Google Maps and you expect it to be correct up to the minute, and you expect it to show your view of the world, or at least the view of the world that the people around you have. So suddenly these big tech companies have to be thinking about multiple different versions all over the world. And I think that's a version of the same thing of the internet just driving people mad in a slightly different way, I think.
And I think you also point out that, these almanacs, they used to come with notes, right? And they were perhaps kind of caveats when you were looking at something, and perhaps it was already 10 years out of date when you consulted it. So you had that sort of context. But we, as you point out, we've got all this data, but our interfaces, we prefer them to be smooth. And so there isn't really space for annotations to take place. I'm thinking, for example, at the bottom of any AI tool now, it says, warning, results might not be accurate, but we don't necessarily see that when we look at Google Maps, right? Or something like that.
Yeah, no, there is a weird thing where on the internet, there is space for any piece of information you could possibly want or need. And yet there is a psychological thing where you kind of want as little as possible. You just want to see the map. You kind of don't want to see a bunch of footnotes going, well, it's complicated. There's different ways of looking at it. You just kind of want to, I think maybe it's about the kind of speed with which you want to take in the information. So weirdly, perversely, old-fashioned atlases did have more room for these kind of disputes, because you could effectively footnote them, whereas that's kind of harder on the online maps. I think you kind of you just sort of want it to give you what you need and then get off and do something else. So yeah, I do think that's a problem.
Perhaps we also don't really want caveats, right? We kind of want our version of the truth and we want it to be smooth and tidy.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's another of the many ways in which the internet is messing us all up. Is like we kind of the bubble phenomenon. Just we kind of like want to read a version of the news that agrees with our priors, and I'm always reluctant to kind of go too far down this road because I also think there's you need to get out of your bubble and read some opinions you disagree with. It's only ever used at lefties and liberals to kind of tell them to spend more time talking to racists. But nonetheless, I kind of do think the bubble phenomenon is to some extent real. Like it is, people do not necessarily. I mean, just look at what's going on with AI. Like AI is deliberately as flattering as possible to users because that's how you keep them using it. Nobody wants an AI that goes, it's a bloody stupid question, isn't it? What's wrong with you? Go read a book. That's not how it's going to work. So yeah.
Go read John's book on borders.
Yeah, I mean, it may contain errors. I'm going to be honest with that. Actually, like we have changed this now. I did get a very nice email about 4 or 5 months ago now from a man saying he as an Irishman who's been living in the Middle East for the past 30 years, I was very excited to read your book. I flipped straight to the chapters that affect the places I've lived. I thought you did a reasonable job. I look forward to reading the rest of the book. However, you probably should know that Tel Aviv is not now and has never been the capital of Israel. The book had been out for about 18 months before anybody noticed that. The number of people who'd been through professionally, let alone the people who read it, and nobody had pointed this out. So I have absolutely no faith whatsoever. There are errors in here. Of course there are errors in here. You just kind of hope that there aren't many and they're not too embarrassing. But still, at least that one's kind of, that's nothing with geopolitical implications, is it? It's fine.
Should we see if there are questions online or in the room for John?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can I pick up the maritime question? Because it seems to me, and I hesitate to say this in front of a geographer, that the north is very dominated by land, and the south is dominated by water. And I wonder how maritime borders affect that process, because you've talked quite a lot about land borders. So would you like to say something about that?
I mean, one area where maritime law comes into borders in the Southern Hemisphere is Las Malvinas, or as they should more properly be called, the Falkland Islands, because Argentina does not have a real claim, let's be honest. That's a lie. They have somehow managed to make everyone forget that they're also a settler colonialist power, by the way, which is fine, but own it. But yeah, so like the Argentinian claim is based entirely on it being a bit close. I mean, the Falklands are closer to Argentina than they are to Britain, but they're not especially close to either. And given that there's been a population of British heritage there for a couple of centuries and they want to remain British overwhelmingly, I would think that self-determination should matter more than the fact that the nearest major landmass, which is a few hundred miles away, is Argentina. And also, it's not really about the islands, is it? It's about the possibility of oil near the islands. So I don't know if this has answered your question. It was just the first story to pop into my head. But I suppose the other thing, the other way in which maritime borders really do come into play in the deep south, as it were, is in the land claims in Antarctica, where that's one of the last chapters in the book. So I think it's actually quite a positive story that kind of in the late 1950s, the world under American leadership kind of managed to come up with a system for kind of like freezing the territorial claims down there. So there's like 7 countries that claim territory in Antarctica, but it's been recognized as a global nature reserve. No one's going to dig for minerals. That's a good thing. We're just treating it as, a nature reserve. That's lovely. But, some of the countries that do have claims down there are Argentina and Chile and New Zealand and Australia and South Africa. And in every case, you can kind of see this is related to which country is closest. There's also Norway, which doesn't work in quite the same way, and inevitably Britain and France. But yeah, that's a maritime border in the south, I suppose.
Ridiculously non-geopolitical, but why 47 borders?
I ran out of space and time. And also, as I said in the introduction, that like my new book has dropped from 35 to 31. This was 51 at one point. And we combined 2 chapters, and there were 3 that ended up as offcuts, which again you can find on the internet on my Substack. And it was just I kept writing until I ran out of time, and then we had too many. And then my editor said, "You know that you do have to do Ireland and Israel. You can't just not do them and hope I won't notice. Go back to your laptop." And after that, there were 51, and the book was too long, so we cut a couple.
But
yeah.
there is a bonus 48th.
Oh, there is, yes. It's also, so like, it's not, it was never 47 borders, it's 47 chapters. Some of them aren't really about a single border, it's more about a concept or something. And then in the paperback, it's actually 48. So the entire title is a bloody lie.
I've got a question from online, and then we'll come here in the audience. We like to think of the UK and by implication the British Isles as settled. But is Brexit the first step in a broader pattern of separations, possibly Scottish independence, or redrawing with a reunited Ireland? And how do you see the borders of our home islands playing out?
Maybe. I personally think, you know, this is based on being overwhelmingly English and living in London. So, you know, the usual "what the hell do I know" caveats are important there. But I feel like a united Ireland is highly likely at some point in the next 50 years, just partly because of the logic of trade. And it's, you know, it's already a bit weird that all the hoops we had to jump through to make Northern Ireland able to trade with both, to keep the border in Ireland open without separating Northern Ireland from Great Britain. That got very complicated. I mean, like when I was, one of the chapters I always knew I wanted to do is the Schleswig-Holstein question. Because I wanted to be the 4th person to understand it. And then when I looked into it, it turns out it's not that complicated. And it's just was it Lord Palmerston? Whoever it was, they were very up their own arse. Just showing off, pretending it was more complicated than it was. Well, it wasn't that hard to understand, but it was difficult to solve because through a series of treaties, which I'm not going to go into, Schleswig and Holstein were both duchies. Schleswig had to be with Denmark, Holstein had to be with Schleswig, and Germany had to be with Holstein. But Germany and Denmark couldn't be the same. And the reason it's difficult to solve is because that is, you know, that is an equation with no solution. A equals B, B equals C, C equals D, A can't equal D. There's just no way of doing that. That is the exact problem we've conjured into being through Brexit in Northern Ireland. So I think between that and also just demographics, like if you kind of, the Catholic population is growing much faster than the Protestant population. I should say nationalists and unionists is probably a better way of putting it. But so I kind of think like between the practical issues and the demographics, a border poll is quite likely at some point in the next few decades. Scotland, I'm less convinced of because for all the reasons that Brexit was a stupid idea, Scottish independence is a stupid idea. I mean, if I was Scottish, I think I probably at some point, maybe 18 months into Boris Johnson, would have been like, okay, I don't care about the economy. I also want out. I think I would probably have switched sides by that point. But it's still, it's not clear how it would work in practice. Yeah, and also, am I far enough south to be safe here? I also think there's a certain amount of Scottish nationalism that's based on pretending to be a victim of British imperialism rather than very much a co-producer of it. So that kind of pisses me off on the internet. But you know, maybe it'll happen. I don't know. Oh, one last thing on that before I move on. There was a very interesting interview with Zach Polinsky the other week, in which he was, he said he was fervently in favour of like Scottish and Welsh independence, and then the interviewer went, "So you're in favour of English independence?" And he went, because I think a lot of people on the progressive side of politics have not thought very much about like if the United Kingdom breaks up, there is going to be a country called England, and what does that mean for all of us? And I think there are just problems with kind of like making both England and Britain reactionary identities. At some point, we are going to need to have one of them, and some of those people, some of us, are going to be left wing. So maybe we should think about reclaiming these things anyway. Hello.
Hello, thank you. My question is now slightly out of sequence, but even before Rob mentioned the fact that the southern hemisphere is extremely watery, I was thinking around the northern pole, and I wondered if you
That's
had any
getting waterier.
predictions there. Well, sure. Because I became very aware at one point about the nomadic peoples in that area who never really thought about those borders that all converged at the top. I wondered if you perhaps have a chapter on that, some reflection.
I don't. I've not looked into it. I don't. I wouldn't like to claim. No, I was going to say I wouldn't like to claim expertise. I don't have. That's what I do for a living. I don't know. Is the honest answer. As I understand it, like a lot of the ice cap has always kind of like changed through the year. Like it's a lot smaller in summer. So I couldn't tell you anything about kind of the movement of the people in the high north. So I don't know how whether they're kind of like whether they're on the sort of ice cap as opposed to the land masses or not. I don't know. In all honesty, can you tell us anything? There are yeah. I mean, I think that's the pattern of border peoples, especially in more marginal land the world over. And I think as it becomes a more important realm of geopolitics, I imagine that will become more important. I mean, like, I suspect probably in the high north, it was relatively easy to kind of wander between Russia and Norway until quite recently. And I think the Norwegians are less happy about that than they were. Just going to guess there. So I suspect that is going to get harder, but I don't know anything about it personally. Sorry.
Thank you. You mentioned the Congress of Vienna earlier.
Good party.
Indeed. I understood that the Brits were offered West Prussia, but turned it down. And I'm just wondering, one, why did they turn it down? And secondly, if they hadn't, do you think it would have made a great difference to history, as in possibly averted the First World War?
Again, we're on the edge of my knowledge. There's a bit of a theme of like, I don't know what I'm talking about. I don't think that can be quite right because the Prussians were quite a key player at the Congress of Vienna, weren't they? So I don't think anyone like they were quite big in the helping win the Napoleonic War. So I don't imagine their territory was being parceled out.
No, the West Prussians are, because they were from the.
Oh, right. Yes, you're quite right. Yes, Cologne and so on. Yeah. Yes, no, I know what you mean now. I can't remember the exact details. That would not, I know, another one of the things that inspired me to write the book is there's an excellent BBC radio strand called How to Invent a Country, which is Misha Glenny and produced by Miles Ward, which is brilliant. They've just done the Balkans, which is about Yugoslavia. But I remember listening to the German series of that, which is one of the first they did. And a guy called Simon Winder, who's written a bunch of books on history and the sort of vaguely Germanic bits of Europe, is one of the regular interviewees. And he talks about how like everyone's so scared about like the French getting back to power, becoming like a major force again after the Napoleonic Wars, that because the Prussians have been on the correct side, they are handed this chunk of territory that contains most of Western Europe's coal and steel wealth, and that enables them to become the industrial superpower that suddenly everyone gets scared of, and that does kind of, I don't think it leads to the First World War, but it does kind of, it leads to German power in a way that kind of like brings about a lot of tension, certainly. I think if it was, I can't imagine it surviving as British for long. That just doesn't make sense. I imagine it would have, like, we never really went in for that, did we? We never really had like large chunks of the continent in a way like the Austrians had Belgium until quite recently and so on like that. But like, you know, we didn't really, that wasn't how the British Empire worked. So I can't imagine it having gone through. But I think maybe a settlement that hadn't kind of like handed all the coal to Prussia might have been in the long-term interest of European peace. But then again, Germany was probably going to unify at some point for all the reasons we've talked about already. And then there would have been tensions. You end up in a few Thucydides trap, don't you, with Britain and France? So I think you probably still end up with another European conflagration at some point.
Can I ask you about borders within a country, political ones?
Please do. That's why you get in trouble.
Yeah, good. There is a parliamentary constituency border commission. I sort of vaguely heard about it from time to time, which every now and then changes the borders of constituencies. Are they following any sensible set of rules demographically? Or would it be more sensible just to impose a grid of 600 squares and then say you're number 1, you're number 2, you're number 3, and so on?
So they do try this, or it's suggested in France after the revolution, when they get very into like, rationalizing everything. And I think it's the Abbé de Sieyès comes up with a map of France divided into grids and suggesting this should be our new look. And it's completely insane. It doesn't work. You obviously can't do that because you end up with like straight line borders kind of ignore natural geography, and it's no good. But there's all sorts of bits of North America where people are in the wrong, what is rationally the wrong country because a straight line drawn on a map ignored natural geography. So it's like the Northwest Angle, which is a part of Minnesota that's completely separated from the rest of the United States and should really be part of Canada. You can't just draw straight lines and expect good sense. But the Boundary Commission I've not looked at for a while, but they do actually follow quite sensible rules. There's like a range of populations. It's like there should be an identity. It should be recognizably a place. There's special rules around like you can ignore the sort of you can move outside the kind of like population limits a bit if you're looking at an island. So like the Isle of Wight is always going to be 1 or 2 because no part of the Isle of Wight is ever going to be stuck onto Southampton or something because it is a place apart. So whatever happened to the population, there will always be separate constituencies there. You're not going to end up with like cross-border constituencies between England and Wales or England and Scotland. It is actually quite a sensible way of doing things, even if not all, like there's always going to be edge cases. There's always going to be people who like, when I was a kid, I was infuriated to learn I was in a constituency called Upminster because I was in the part of Hornchurch that was very nearly Romford, and Upminster was bloody miles away. And it's just like the ward that I happened to be in had got glommed onto Upminster. But like, it doesn't really, it's all one place. It's all the same bit of like Essex suburbia. So that's fine, but they're never going to give like Berwick upon Tweed to Scotland or anything. And if you look at the alternative of like what's happened in the US with gerrymandering, where you kind of let the politicians themselves do it, that's insane and extremely bad. So kind of actually having an independent commission with a rules-based order feels quite good to me, I think.
Is there perhaps one last question?
I was just going to take it one level down, which was to city boundaries.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about Milton Keynes, where we're sitting, and we have a 60s plan, which draws a great big square almost on a blank map. And then now we have an established city and boundaries that housing wants to push out beyond. Is there a best way to draw city boundaries that avoid some of those problems with NIMBYism and resistance to the city that's big and next door to you?
It is a problem. I don't have this is one of those moments where like if I had a really good answer to that, I would probably be selling consultancy services for a lot more money than I get for writing books. But yeah, it is a problem. Like you do end up with the example I always think of is Oxford, where like Oxford has on some measures one of the worst housing crises in Britain. It is like the house prices there as a multiple of wages. I don't know if they still are, but for a long time they certainly were. They were the highest multiple of local wages. And there are many reasons for that, but one of them is it's completely impossible for the city to build more housing on its edge because it's so tightly bounded that all the green space around, even if it wasn't greenbelt, is in neighbouring local authorities like Cherwell or something. So like the problems all accrue to the city, but the only way of solving them involves building outside the city and in places that don't want to do that because they're based on completely different settlements. So I do think you kind of need to regularly review these things. A lot of our city boundaries make no sense. Nottingham is very small. Sheffield is very big. I don't know about Milton Keynes specifically, but Milton Keynes is also, I think, still the only example of a city in Britain that combines good wages and affordable housing, relatively affordable. And that is because it's kept building and it's it's easy to get to London and Birmingham and Oxford and Cambridge and so on. So it's just really well located. Yeah, so I don't know about the specifics of expanding the boundary, but this is certainly a problem. It does have, where you draw the edge of your city does have a real impact. If you just look at like where the New York subway stops, it just kind of, it doesn't make any sense except you kind of hit the city boundary and they didn't build anymore. So yeah, it does have a real impact.
Note of the superiority of Milton Keynes. Please join me in thanking Jonn very much for his.
Thank you all for coming on
fascinating-
Sunny Friday.
Thank you both very much for a fascinating conversation. I think I thoroughly enjoyed that. I hope everybody else did as well. And that's been an absolute privilege to have both of you here today from K-Litfo. So another round of applause, please. Thank you.